I couldn't breathe for a full 10 seconds after he said it. 10 seconds where the whole kitchen, our kitchen, the one he'd refinished with his own hands last winter, the one where we'd stood under holiday lights and promised each other forever, seemed to tilt, to reveal seams, to show me how thin the promises had always been. If I had married your girlfriend, at least she would have been a real woman, he shouted, voice ricocheting off the cabinets like a thrown plate. The words didn't just land. They detonated, scattering glass, history, the small, careful kindnesses that had been folded into our life like little paper cranes. I remember the precise way the sunlight hit the saltshaker on the counter. I remember the tremor in the stem of his hand as he put a mug down too hard. I remember the smell of his coffee burnt and suddenly forced. I stood there, 40, tired, a small laugh stuck somewhere behind my teeth, and realized, with the peculiar clarity of someone who's been reading a page and suddenly notices there's a different language beneath, that the person I had married and the man in front of me were no longer the same species. We'd met when we were younger than we are now, in a city that felt like it was made of possibility. He'd kissed me in the rain outside a closed bookstore and promised to speak for me when I lost my own voice. He taught me how to tie a tie that first winter we'd learned to wear suits for work, how to make scrambled eggs the way my grandmother did. He learned the names of my friends' children and cheered way too loudly at my bad college performances. We had a child, our son Jonah, who arrived with my stubborn chin in his laugh. For a long time, the thing I loved about him, or thought I did, was how ordinary he was. Dependable as a thermostat, unwavering as a lighthouse. It was ordinary that kept us warm through the early fights about money and careers. Ordinary that let us sleep in the same bed even when we no longer wanted to speak. And then there was Claire. Claire with her cropped hair and a laugh that reminded me of summers I had forgotten. Claire who handed me a worn copy of a book I'd said I adored but never actually owned, and who looked at me like she believed the things I told her were true. At first, Claire was a secret that felt like a blessing, a messenger who brought back the old me, a woman who could inhabit desire that had nothing to do with my role as wife, mother, or negotiator. Loving Claire didn't feel like taking something from my husband. It felt like finding an extra room in myself someone had bricked up. I did not flaunt it. God knows I didn't intend to hurt anyone. I folded my affection into the small crevices of my life. Weekend texts, a shared cigarette beneath a moon that smelled like wet pavement, a lunchtime coffee where we pretended the world didn't know we were stealing minutes. But secrets, even tender ones, gather their own gravity. They get heavy, then awkward, then impossible to hold. The day he said the thing about my girlfriend was the day he found the text thread. He didn't read them as messages. He read them as indictments. Under his fingers, the phone screen seemed to melt, and the words rearranged themselves into a history I had not told him aloud. Betrayal for him was not a passive sorrow to survive. It was a weapon sharpened and held at my throat. You lied to me, he said, but his voice was not sorrow. It was accusation and ownership. You made me a fool. He raised his hand as if to strike, not at me, at the air, and I flinched from a movement that somehow had always been there, hidden under his kindness. Our fight bled into days. He moved out, or rather I moved him out. We argued about who would keep what, who would pay which bill. Jonah was the struck-through line on every legal form, the thing we both claimed to love with our teeth clenched. The divorce lawyers had the soft, professional voices of ushers shepherding us through a funeral we had not anticipated. There were calls, friends picking sides, some with pity, some with quiet judgment. It became, in the unromantic way of the modern world, a spreadsheet of grievances. Who had been unfaithful when what words had been used, what photos existed. The documents had the whiteness of a diagnosis. The house, once humming with the small rituals of family life, felt like a set waiting for the next scene. I was raw then, open, aching, furious in a way that made me ashamed. When people say revenge, they imagine a mission in a black leather coat, a slow-burning theatrical devastation. That kind of revenge belongs to movies. Real revenge is quieter, more meticulous. I could have called a lover's spurned sister and demanded justice on television, but the fight I felt inside was not about spectacle. It was about reclaiming a life that had been dismissed as less than because I loved differently. It was about teaching him and myself that dignity is not measured by the approval of someone who refuses to see you fully. So I began to build, not out of spite at first, more because it was the only thing that made me feel like oxygen again, but the building became strategy. I took a job at an agency that needed someone who could make narrative matter. I had spent years weaving our family mythology into the story of who I was, and it turned out that skill, applied to advertising, meant clients paid for me to make other people love things. I learned to speak boardroom Italian, crisp, tempered sentences that hid hunger. I started running again. Small indifferent victories, a negotiated raise, a half marathon completed in a time that made me weep at the finish line, coagulated into confidence. Claire and I did not immediately become a public spectacle of triumph. We were lovers who ate cheap curries after midnight and made playlists that played like our private newspaper. She brought me coffee when the nights were long and the legal papers had turned into a labyrinth. She told me, with an unbothered tenderness, that I didn't need to announce myself to be real. That steadied me, but revenge is patient. It takes the raw material of your pain and makes a new altar out of it. I used our pain like a scalpel, precise and cold. Hetz, my ex-husband, tried to make me the villain in our story. He told Jonah things about me, about secrets that had been misread, about choices that, in his retelling, made me monstrous. I remember the first meeting with Jonah after the separation. His face a child's map of betrayal and confusion, his little fists clenching like a soldier. I cried when he left, then scrubbed my face until my skin felt unfamiliar. The battle for custody was looming. In it, the honest, naked truth would be on display for strangers to judge and label. I had to be smarter than pain. I hired a lawyer who smelled like citrus and talked like a person who had seen every kind of human collapse and rise again. "We'll win," she said, not as comfort, but as a pragmatic assessment. "If you can show stability, a safe environment, a pattern of care. If you involve community, if you document." So I documented. I made a calendar that smelled like hope, school concerts circled, play dates scheduled with neighbors, the TOE volunteer hours tallied carefully. I wrote journals that were not for therapists but for evidence, notes about meals, notes about smiles. It felt small, but the system drinks smallness. Judges, custody evaluators, people who make moral decisions in a mechanized world prefer neatness. When the custody hearing came, it was cold and clinical. We sat in a room that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and legal ennui. He wore a suit that seemed to signal his belief in the gravity of the offense. I wore a dress that I had chosen because I wanted to look like someone whose life was in order. We presented evidence, photos of Jonah in my lap, a schedule of my time off work, text messages that showed me co-parenting in a way that was steady, not theatrical. He presented a narrative of my perceived instability, of my choices that had supposedly endangered our son. He called witnesses, friends who corroborated his version of events with the meticulousness of a chorus. I could feel the room weighing us like coins. The verdict was not absolute. The judge, a woman with a soft voice that had an edge of iron, split custody. She urged us to cooperate. It was in a way worse than losing. That split custody was a paper-thin truce, a device that made both of us into caretakers of a broken peace. Jonah would live with me 3 nights a week and weekends. He'd spend the rest with his father. I left the courthouse with papers clutched like talismans and a strange sense of victory that tasted like metal. That's when I stopped pretending revenge would be passive. I began to imagine a life that had nothing to do with his approval. I invented projects, a small art installation that merged the clutter of domestic life with the formal elegance of gallery pieces, a photography series that played with identity and expectation, a podcast where I interviewed people who had been reshaped by choices the world called scandalous. The projects were not crafted as knives but as light, spotlights the size of blowtorches that threw his stories into relief, and my own into full, unavoidable color. His arrogance was a pattern. Men like him, comfortable, certain, the ones who believe that their understanding of the world is the world, build reputations that are delicate. He worked in a law firm where reputation mattered. He'd been promoted to a managerial role because he looked like he belonged. I found out through friends who owed me these soft favors and through the quiet work of social listening, the new currency of our age, that a few clients had quietly complained. Unreturned emails, meetings canceled, a volatility that hadn't shown until his house fell apart. The firm was sensitive to scandal. Companies, more than marriages, fear public mess. I could have sold my story to a tabloid. I could have screamed about betrayal on a morning show and watched the world pick at the carcass of my life for clicks. But I chose strategy again. I began to network exactly the way one would if hunting a promotion. I asked for connections, returned favors, sent wine baskets with notes of harmless cheer. I cultivated an image of success that was deliberate and slow, speaking engagements that reminded people that complexity is human, op-eds about caregiving and identity that were read by the kind of people who have soft power. Claire, who was less interested in spectacle than I was, supported me in a quiet, practical way, editing my drafts at midnight, showing up at gallery openings like a quiet anchor. A former client, perhaps angry at the firm for other reasons, mentioned in an offhand conversation how distracted their attorney had been. Something about a messy personal life, a gossip like an elegant poison, spreads. The firm started internal conversations. My ex's work performance was reviewed. Emails were found angry, unprofessional, revealing a man who had not been steady. He was placed on a temporary leave while HR clarified expectations. For someone whose identity had been bound to competence and control, the humiliation of being reviewed in private memos was deeper than any public spectacle. I did not dance on his ruins. He lost a title, not dignity. One is external, the other internal. But the consequences were real. A demotion, a public mention of a conduct concerns that some clients read between the lines as a lack of professionalism. The law firm, a thing built from the careful, brittle bones of reputation, nursed itself like any self-respecting organism. It trimmed what looked diseased. There was a settlement. There were quiet payments and silence clauses, irony carved in legal stone. He had wanted to hurt me. He had achieved his own undoing. What surprised me more than his fall was what happened next inside myself. Revenge, when it's pure, is hollow if it ends at someone else's expense. Victory only tastes like victory when your life is fuller and your heart is less brittle. So I continued to build not to spike but to flourish. I finished the project that became a small sensation in our town, an installation that made domestic objects sing with ache. The podcast episodes I recorded with single parents and people who loved differently cut like scalpel, true and bright. Listeners wrote to tell me their lives had new texture because they'd heard someone else's honest fear. I dated awkwardly, beautifully, and found that each new coffee with someone who saw me for me was a minor miracle. Claire stood by me for 2 years, and then we drifted into a gentler friendship. We had loved each other fiercely. Sometimes love is a season. Jonah, as he grew older, asked hard questions. Why did Daddy move out? Why do you like girls sometimes? Why do people say things that sting? I answered the best I could, not with the tidy absolutes that parents sometimes present, but with the honest, sometimes inconvenient truths. I told him the story of his life in pieces, the way we all get things wrong, the way people apologize and sometimes don't know how, the way bravery is often just showing up. I let him see me cry, to teach him the strange courage of vulnerability. Years later, 3, then 5, he called me from college, his voice a comfortable and surprising new register. He asked whether he could bring a friend over for dinner. The friend was Rachel, who had eyes that laughed like a promise, and Jonah introduced her like someone unveiling a favorite song. He looked at me with that same rare transparency he'd shown as a toddler when he was proud to discover the star on a completed homework assignment. You and Claire taught me that people are complicated, he said once, surprising me with the exactness of it, as if a fortune teller had told him the future and he'd kept the map, and that it's okay to be complicated. I wanted to cry then again, but this time it was not only grief but gratitude, a warm, expansive thing that filled the space where anger had been. My ex too moved through life. He remarried later in a quiet ceremony where his new wife wore a dress with pockets and a laugh like a small bell. He left the firm for something quieter, something that suited his particular brand of neatness, consulting where he could manage variables in a controlled way. Sometimes we saw each other at school events, two adults orbiting the same small sun, and our conversations were polite, an exchange of logistic favors and shared respect for the child we both loved. We were not friends. We were, finally, two people who had learned the hard arithmetic of living together and then apart. If revenge taught me anything, it is that the worst parts of people are not always their final standing. The man who had shouted the cruel, stupid line in the kitchen did not become a caricature of evil. He became, in time, someone who had to live with his choices and the quiet humility that obedience to pride can require. He changed by accident, not design, the way river stones are smoothed by years of water. I changed by intention. I accepted that the part of me that loved Claire and loved different flavors of life was not less valid than the normative life we tried to maintain. I insisted on my complexity like a right. There is a particular evening I keep visiting in my head. Jonas, now grown, and I in the garden behind my house, the same house where he'd learned to ride a bike, and then fallen off and gotten up again. We drank badly made iced tea, and the sky held the residue of sunset. He asked me to teach him to make scrambled eggs the way my grandmother had. I showed him, fingers dipped in oil, the slow, patient folding. We laughed at how such a small thing could feel like a right. At one point, he leaned back against me and said, "You were brave." It was the kind of praise I do not believe was meant only to compliment, but to acknowledge the labor of my life. The small, steady rebellions against shame. Years of rebuilding taught me another truth. Revenge is not an endpoint, but a lesson in resourcefulness. The currencies of the modern world, public image, social capital, legal protections, are tools that can be wielded, yes, to wound. But they can also be used to reclaim autonomy, to write new sentences into the grammar of one's life. I channeled my fury into work that mattered, into art that honored messy humanity, and into parenting that taught Jonah to be a man who listened. I exposed hypocrisy not by humiliation, but by being better. Not by shouting, but by making a life whose brightness could not be dismissed. I do not tell this story to position myself as virtuous. There are pockets of my life where shame still lives. Those moments where I wonder if I should have been kinder, where I think perhaps my weaponization of success was, in some small ways, vindictive. But then I remember the moment in the kitchen, the saltshaker, and the way the light fell, and I forgive myself for the human desire to be seen and for the strategies I used to ensure that seeing would be kinder the next time. Vindication came in many forms. In a court order, in a job demotion, yes, but also in the quiet dignity of being loved and recognized for all the versions of myself that had once been labeled wrong. If there is a moral to this particular messy American tale, if I can be so bold as to offer one, it is that dignity is reclaimed by acts that build, not just by acts that destroy. The best revenge I ever enacted was not the one that cost him his job, though that felt righteous. The best revenge was my life, untidy, loud at times, tender at others, carved out of the ruins of a marriage that had lied about what it could contain. It was the life that let Jonah and me love one another without apology, and the life that let me love whoever I loved without fear. Sometimes, when I make scrambled eggs, I think of him, the man who once thought himself entitled to call anyone and not a real woman on the basis of his narrow, terrified vision. I do not pity him so much as I pity the smaller world he inhabits when he refuses to expand. I pity the people who will never learn to rearrange their lives with curiosity because they fear the messiness of authenticity. And as for me, keep building. I keep choosing love in many forms, and I refuse to allow a single hateful sentence to define the whole of who I am. The last lines of my revenge were not headlines. They were the small, fierce acts of daily living, teaching Jonah to fold eggs, laughing at a stupid joke shared in the dark, holding hands with a woman who knows all my best and worst arguments. That, in the end, was the true victory. The simple, blazing fact that I was still alive to be complicated, and that complexity was not a crime but a kind of miracle.